All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another virtual gallery talk in collaboration with the Addison Gallery of American Art. My name is Nicole Kramer. I am the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Memorial Hall Library in Andover. I want to thank the Addison for sharing their exhibitions and artwork with the wider community. We really appreciate this partnership. Be sure to check out the Memorial Hall Library calendar or Addison Gallery website for upcoming programs and tours. The Addison Gallery is located on the campus of Phillips Academy here in Andover. It is free and open to the public. So if you are close to Andover, I encourage you to visit the gallery to enjoy their regularly changing exhibitions in person, including Parasol Press, Breaking New Ground, which is the exhibition that we will be learning more about today. Throughout today's program, please put any questions in the Q&A. We will plan to address as many of them as we can at the end of the talk. We are recording the program, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording tomorrow afternoon. And today we are joined by Rachel Vogel, Assistant Curator at the Addison, for a discussion of the first exhibition to survey Parasol Press's remarkable publications from 1970 to 2014. This exhibition showcases radical innovations that pushed the boundaries of printmaking and secured Parasol's place as one of the most important print publishers of the 20th century. This exhibition will be on display through the end of July, so I hope you get a chance to see it in person after today's talk. Rachel, thank you so much for being here. I will now turn things over to you.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And thank you all for being here. It's a real treat to be able to partner with Memorial Hall Library on these programs, to be able to extend, the reach of our exhibitions across the country. And so I thank you all for being here. I will say that this exhibition is one that is definitely worth seeing in person. So I'm thrilled to be able to take you through, but if you are in the area, please do come see us, come visit in person. As Nicole mentioned, the exhibition is on view until the end of July. All right, I will go ahead and share my screen. All right. So, as Nicole mentioned, Parasol Press Breaking New Ground is the first full retrospective to survey the prints published by Parasol Press, which was a publisher that was founded in New York in 1970 by Bob Feldman, who happens to be an alum of Phillips Academy and a huge champion of the Addison Gallery of American Art. So it was a real honor to be able to put this exhibition together as a tribute to his major contributions to not only the world of printmaking, but the world of contemporary art at large, and be able to bring that work to a wider audience. And one thing that really makes Parasol's publications unique is the consistent ways in which artists were really pushing the boundaries of printmaking as a medium. And so artists were embracing the possibilities. Many of them were making prints for the very first time, and they really took up that challenge in earnest. And as we'll discuss throughout this tour, really took interest in how the medium could serve their practice. And so throughout the exhibition, there's this sort of through line of this kind of reciprocal relationship between artists and printmaking. On one hand, artists are pushing printmaking in new directions. They're approaching it in new ways. They are, rigorously experimental in the way that they produce prints and portfolios. But at the same time, I argue that printmaking is impacting these artists, that there's something that comes from this engagement with often a new medium that allowed them to consider different parts of their practices that perhaps they hadn't fully explored. And often the lessons that they take from their time in the print workshop, we see not only continue in later prints, but also in their practice at large. And so Parasol Press is a publisher. So Feldman was not himself a printmaker. This is a moment, the 1960s and 70s are often described as the American print Renaissance. There was a real energy towards enhancing the field of printmaking with new collaborative workshops like ULAAE on Long Island and Tamarind, first in Los Angeles. Tamarind is also a print training program, so there's the creation of new master printers. And so new artists are also coming to the medium, and there's this real moment of energy. Prior to this moment in time, print was really seen as a kind of secondary medium, that it didn't sort of rise to the status of painting or sculpture. But the prints made during this time period, and especially some of the prints produced by Parasol, really served to challenge that belief and demonstrate the centrality of printmaking to the development of contemporary art. And so, as a publisher, Feldman is really a matchmaker. He is inviting artists who he thinks would be able to make interesting work in printmaking. And he's matching them with printers who are working in techniques and working in processes that he thinks align with that artist's working methods. And throughout the exhibition, there are moments where artists first started working in one medium and then realized that another would better serve their purpose. So Feldman's job was to really support that relationship building. He also is the financial backer for these prints. So he's funding their production. And as I mentioned, prints are really coming into their own, but they hadn't yet quite developed a market. And so this was a huge risk to be able to, hope and wish that these prints will be able to sort of make their money back, but really only going on true faith in the work of these artists and the work of these printers. And so, as a publisher, this role of matchmaker, this role of champion, and he also is trying to find new audiences for printmaking. Broadening the world of print collectors and print connoisseurs, helping museums to acquire more contemporary prints when departments might have previously focused more on, prints coming out of the Renaissance period. And so it's through this kind of faith and risk taking on artists and on prints that Parasol is able to produce its remarkable publications. Um, and so, as I mentioned, there's some real technical innovations that are happening in Parasol's publications. And to that end, I want to go over very, very briefly the most sort of basic principles of printmaking. And so, what makes printmaking unique is that instead of a singular painting, printmaking allows for multiple impressions. And there are four main categories of prints. Relief prints, and you can see in this graphic here, the blue represents what is printed onto the page. And so in relief prints, you are carving away anything that you don't want to print. So these are woodcuts or lino cuts. And in intaglio prints, it's the reverse. You are making incisions into usually a copper plate. And when paper is dampened and run through the press, the paper sits into those recesses and lifts the ink out of those recesses. And so here you're working more positively. What the marks that you make are the ones that will print. And then there's lithographs, which operate by the repulsion of oil and water. And so most traditionally, this is done on a limestone, but can also do on a specially treated plate, where the image is chemically treated, and so that it repels water and absorbs the greasy ink, and the non-image area repels the ink after it's moistened. It's truly like a kind of alchemical, magical process. And then screen prints are the only printmaking process that don't involve reversal. And so for this, a fine mesh screen is used. The image areas are left open and everything else is blocked off, and the ink using a squeegee is pushed through that fine mesh and transferred onto the paper below. Um, and so we will very soon, the payoff for this sort of lesson in printmaking will come very soon, I promise. So the exhibition begins with a section called Bold Beginnings that focuses on a single artist, Wayne Thiebaud. And so Parasol is founded in the back room of the Alan Stone Gallery. And Alan Stone, another Phillips Academy alum, at this moment is showing artists like Thiebaud, a Bay Area artist. Um, so some of Parasol's first publications are artists that Bob was able to meet through Alan Stone. And so he Feldman invites Thiebaud to make a series of prints for Parasol. And typically, a portfolio would be produced in one technique with one workshop. But Thiebaud is very excited by the prospect of exploring printmaking. He had made a few prints before with Catherine Brown at Crown Point Press. At this point, it's in her basement of her house in Berkeley. And so he says, I want to make prints in all four of these techniques. And Feldman, he was most comfortable with lithographs and screen prints. He sees these as kind of the sort of future of contemporary printmaking. He also is excited by the possibility of sending Thiebaud to work in France with the printer who printed lino cuts for Picasso, Jaime Arnera. And so he's like, okay, we can do lithographs, we can do screen prints, we can do lino cuts. But I'm not really sold on etchings. They're these really typically small, black and white, scratchy lines. I don't think I can sell these, especially when Thiebaud is really known for his color. But Thiebaud had worked with Catherine Brown before and was really insistent on producing another body of work with her. So the deal is that Feldman would publish these prints with Catherine Brown, one of the only printers who's really working in intaglio in this moment, but on the condition that they're aquatints, which allows you to print tone rather than line, and that they're colorful, so that they fit in with the rest of the portfolio. And so Thiebaud makes two portfolios, seven still lifes and a silver landscape, and seven still lifes and a rabbit. Both combine four different techniques across four different workshops. And what you see across these portfolios is the way that Thiebaud is embracing the different possibilities from each printmaking process. So here we have an example of a lino cut and an aquatint. And as I mentioned before, in one, you're carving away the non-image area, and in the other, you're working directly with the marks that you're making are what is printed. And so even though he is using similar subject matter, lollipops and cakes, the sort of foodstuffs that Thiebaud is best known for, he's having to work in completely different ways. And I love the way that comparing these two images, you can see, for example, the way that the shadows in the lino cut, are built up from these multiple flat layers of ink, and they get this kind of frosting-like texture. Whereas the inks are printed much more transparently in the aquatints. And so you see this more subtle play of shadow where you see, for example, the red peeking out from underneath the blue. And so while he is exploring these different printmaking techniques, he's figuring out how he can also adapt his own working method to align best with the different processes. And I love how in both of these images we have this sense of repetition, the slices of cake and the lollipops. And to me, it also seems like this kind of tongue-in-cheek reference to printmaking itself, its ability to produce multiples. And so the next section, so I should say, when Thiebaud shows Feldman these aquatints that he made with Catherine Brown, Feldman is blown away. He did not know that aquatints or intaglio prints could look like this. He's thrilled by the possibilities. The wheels in his mind start turning, and he immediately starts sending other artists to work with Cathin at Crown Point Press. And as I mentioned, this is in her basement. Crown Point would go on to become and still is one of the most important printers and now print publishers. And a lot of its sort of early recognition came from the prints that it did with Parasol. And so immediately, Feldman invites Sol LeWitt, a leading conceptual artist, to make prints with Cathin. He shows up at her house. She must have written the date wrong because she described, not expecting him, and he just comes, knocks on her door, almost gets barreled over by her large dogs as she answers the door. And even though she wasn't expecting him, they immediately get to work and they make about 46 prints in that first session. And LeWitt and Brown would go on to have a prolific relationship, printing together up until LeWitt's death. And so this next section, the serial attitude, focuses on what really made Parasol Press famous, which was the prints that it published by minimal and conceptual artists in the 1970s. And so these artists, most hadn't had prior printmaking experience. LeWitt happened to, he did study printmaking, but most of these artists didn't have any experience with printmaking. And they're making work that doesn't necessarily seem like it would translate to print. But Feldman sees this potential here and invites them to make prints. And really, this is at a moment where even conceptual and minimal art itself is sort of just gaining prominence. So he's really at the vanguard of this new generation of artists, and he's interested in what happens if he can get them into the print workshop. And so this section really is thinking about how these minimal and conceptual artists are finding in printmaking things that are inherent to their practice. The idea of seriality, the idea of delegation, the idea of multiple possibilities. This is this kind of iterative attitude that kind of defines minimal art at this moment. And so a great example of this is the work that you see on screen, which is called Scribbles, made during that first visit that LeWitt took to Crown Point Press. And so what I love about this work is it both is, completely consistent with LeWitt's tendencies. He often sort of creates a system for himself and then demonstrates every possibility of this system. So in this case, he makes a single plate and he scribbles on it, creating this sort of dense, wiry mass of scribbles. And then he tells Brown to print it in 4 different colors on 4 different sheets. And every time she prints in a different color to rotate the square plate. So the first 4 prints in the series are printed in 4 what are called process colors: black, yellow, red, and blue. And this is the foundation of really all printmaking, from fine art printmaking to your magazines or books. And the idea is using a halftone screen with all 4 of these colors. They can be combined to create any shade. Their overlaps create, all colors. And so most commercial printmaking, if you open up a magazine, is used, done in the same way. It's broken down into 4 colors. And so LeWitt is sort of playing on this aspect of printmaking. And goes on to print first 1 color, then 2 colors. So these 6 prints are every combination of 2 of the previous colors. And then the next 4 prints are 3 colors, one of which you see on the left. And then finally, all 4 colors printed. And because the plate is being rotated for each color, the scribbles don't exactly match up. They create this even more sort of dense, colorful web. And so while in typical printing, when you print the fourth plate, it would all sort of come together to create this image. Here, it becomes sort of more rational, more chaotic, more indecipherable. Whereas you can see in the first plates, if you look closely, you can even, track squiggle to squiggle to see that the plate is being rotated. But by the time you get to the end of the series, it's just this overwhelming mass of scribbles. So he's sort of playing against expectation that here, when you print all of the layers, they don't sort of add up to another image. They are the demonstration of the system that he laid out for himself. So he's both continuing his serial processes, but he's also playing with the conventions of printmaking. Another work in this section of the exhibition is Robert Mangold's Three Aquatints, which I love how well it works with the Solowit wall drawing that runs across the cove of one of our galleries. And so, like Lewitt, Mangold is rotating these plates. So these three prints are all made with the exact same three plates, but configured, inked in different colors, and then configured in different orientations. And these prints correspond to the shaped canvases that Mangold was making, kind of blurring the line between painting and sculpture. So here, he's really embracing the sort of sculptural potential of printmaking as well, treating these copper plates as elements that he could combine and construct these different, as you can see, quite large compositions. And because intaglio, the plate is being pressed into the paper with a tremendous amount of force. You can't see quite in these images, but there are plate marks around each of the three plates. And so that same sense of dimensionality or of, making the viewer aware, in this case, of the relationship between the image and paper is very similar to his other work at this time, where he's making you aware of the relationship between, the borders, the edges of the canvas, and the wall that supports it. This is the back wall of the section featuring two other artists who are also working in these kind of serial ways. So looking at printmaking's potential to kind of iterate on a theme. And so on the left, you see 10 Days by Bryce Marden. When Martin goes to Crown Point Print, he really is excited by all of the technical possibilities. And so the first few days that he's there, he's just experimenting with different techniques. And he is really interested in sort of encouraging mistakes or unanticipated results that emerge from the printmaking process itself. So he's almost treating printmaking as a kind of collaborator. And so we see this is print A, the first print in that series, 10 Days. On the left, he is encouraging these kinds of marks. So it's not, pure white, but instead, at one point, you can see where he's leaned over the plate that was had a sticky, soft ground on it. And you can see the imprint of his sweater. In other places, you can see fingerprints. And fingerprints are typically exactly what you do not want in the printmaking workshop. These master printers are trained to do everything they can to make sure that there are no fingerprints interrupting a print. But that's exactly what Martin wanted. He wanted to show the process. And so here, even in this print, we see him experimenting with different ways of building up tone. So in the middle panel, you see him making these hatch marks and really building up this density of line. And then on the right, you can still see some of that density of line, but he's deepening that tone by using aquatint. And so he, throughout this series, is playing with layering. He increases the transparency of inks in order to be able to see what is printed below them. As I mentioned, he's encouraging these kinds of mistakes or, stray marks. And for him, he said that the reason that he wanted to include that kind of mark making in the left panel is so that to ensure that those panels would read as surfaces and not as voids. So he's really thinking about the fact that printmaking is, a surface that he is working on and wanting to translate that into the final print. Here's just another quick example from this series that shows kind of his iteration and experimentation. So on the left, you see an etching where he's creating a grid and filling it in with kind of these scribbled lines similar to Lewitt. And then on the right, this is a different print, but he has a black aquatint ground, and then he's printing the same plate as we see in print D, but in this kind of graphite gray ink so that it changes the kind of relationship between figure and ground. Here's a kind of blurry, sorry for that, close up, so that you can see that that gray inking is the same lines as in the previous print. And the last print I'll talk about in this section is Agnes Martin's On a Clear Day. And so when Feldman reached out to Agnes Martin to see if she'd be interested in producing a series of prints, she had not been making much art. She had not really been a part of the art world. So she, in 1967, left New York and she moved to New Mexico and sort of withdrew from both painting and from largely from exhibiting and participating in the art world. And so Feldman really has to kind of convince her that not only should she return to art making, but that she should return to a process she'd never made before. And for those of you who are familiar with Agnes Martin's work, he thought that etching would be the perfect medium. It would sort of recreate or allow her to, in a different medium, embrace the kind of delicate, drawn lines that are in her drawings and paintings. But Martin is insistent that if she makes prints, they be prints. They not try and do something similar to what she's doing in other media. And so she had just recently seen a group of prints by Josef Albers, and she said, "That's what I want to do. I want to make screen prints. I want that same kind of perfectly straight edge that I saw in Albers's prints. I want to see what that does if my drawings are translated into screen print." And so the work is made up of 30 separate prints that each are a different combination of grids or horizontal lines that all have their own play with, rhythm and spacing, with density. And Martin was very particular about both the ink color and the paper color because she was very precise about the sort of figure-ground relationship in these prints. And so she sent her drawings to Edition Domberger in Stuttgart, Germany, and then goes to Germany to oversee the production of the edition, and settles on this sort of off-white paper in gray ink, so that it's this very subtle. It's not as high contrast as black on white. And so across these 30 prints, even though she's interested in screen print's ability to create these kind of mechanically ruled lines. You can tell from the title that she's still thinking about these as kind of organic metaphors. And so she likens the experience of, taking in these 30 prints as, akin to lying back and looking at the clouds, go by, where they're all the same thing, but they're each unique, or standing on the shore and watching the waves come in, each unique, even though they're part of, a series of similar things. And so she really is inviting you to enter into this contemplative relationship with these works and let them wash over you and experience that kind of difference in repetition. So the next section of the exhibition is called Prints About Process. And this goes back to something I mentioned at the top of this talk, how artists were really embracing the possibilities of printmaking, often to the point where printmaking itself seems to become the sort of subject matter of the prints. And a great example of this is these prints by Sol LeWitt. And so I have a collection of them in the exhibition. It's kind of hard to tell from this detail, but the text in all of these images is reversed. You can see that a little bit better in the print on the right. And so this is actually the first print that LeWitt made when he visits Crown Point Press. And so I mentioned he had made prints before, but Catherine Brown sets him up with a copper plate. And typically, LeWitt is best known for his wall drawings, in which he would make a series of instructions and diagrams, and then other people would execute those instructions on a wall. And so there is this sort of distance between LeWitt's idea and then the actual execution. This is the sort of premise of his contribution to conceptual art, that the idea is the artwork. So he sits down and he writes himself an instruction to follow, which you can see on the bottom. He writes lines, not long, not straight, and not touching. And immediately Catherine runs over and says, "Oh, no, 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 no. That's going to reverse when you actually print. It's best not to do things with handwriting. It's really hard to write backwards." And LeWitt says, "No, no, no. I'm familiar with printmaking. I know exactly what I'm doing." And he continues to write out this instruction and then follow that instruction in the actual image, which is a series of lines, not long, not straight, and not touching. And so, what happens in this print is that when it is reversed, we are reminded of the fact that what we are looking at is not a drawing that LeWitt makes with his own hand. There's this interference through the press, and the press is contributing its own sort of creativity in a way to the print by reversing it. So in the same way that in his wall drawings, LeWitt is making the instructions and other people are actually making the wall drawing, here he is making the matrix, the plate, as a sort of set of instructions that are then read or interpreted by the press itself. And so by having these prints, which he makes several of throughout the 70s, where the text is intentionally reversed, it's this reminder of this sort of active delegation that is central to printmaking. Another artist who is really thinking about the operations of the print workshop is Dorothea Rockburn. This is her Locust series from 1973 to 75, and these are some of my favorite prints, not only in the show, but in our collection, perhaps of all time. They're these beautiful, subtle prints. And they don't reproduce well. These are definitely some that if you have the opportunity to see them in person, please do. And so when Rockburn enters the workshop, she's really struck by the pressure of the press, that prints are not, two-dimensional objects, that paper has a dimensionality, that there's a tremendous amount of pressure that is producing these ostensibly flat, but we know they're not actually flat objects. And so she takes that up as the sort of central conceit of this portfolio. And so each of the prints in the series, she folds according to a sort of mathematically derived concept, creating what she calls major and minor spines. And then those folded sheets of paper are run through the press to deepen those folds. So when they're exhibited, they sort of exist as these kind of sculptural low reliefs. You can see that they're catching shadows, that they have parts that come towards you as the viewer. And after these prints are folded and run through the press, she takes an aquatint plate that's inked in white ink, and she runs that, or the printers rather, run the folded sheet of paper with the aquatint plate again through the press several times. So you can see on the detail of the right, because it's white ink, it doesn't create much tone, but you see this texture of the aquatint, this sort of pebbly texture. The white ink catches light differently than the uninked paper, so you have an even further level of different dimensionality because different planes of the paper are reflecting light in different ways. And because the paper is folded, you also get ink on both sides of the print. And there's almost this invitation to kind of figure out how these prints were made, how they were folded. Okay, if we see ink on this side but not on this side, that means this must have been faced out. And so it kind of invites the viewer into reconstructing the process of folding for themselves to understand these as three-dimensional folded objects. In addition to the folds creating dimensionality, the plate mark itself is creating this other level of dimension. And there are these really beautiful moments in the prints where, because they're folded over each other, we get both embossment and debossment. So here you can see where the plate is indenting the paper down. And then here you can see that the paper is coming up towards you, towards the viewer. And so you have this sort of relationship of receding and coming forward. You have the dimensionality of these plate marks, the dimensionality of these folded sheets, all reminding us both of the pressure and dimensionality of the printmaking process, as well as I mentioned, inviting us to sort of really think through how these prints were made. Another artist who's really interested in these kind of subtle aspects of printmaking and how he can explore them is Robert Ryman, who is known during this period for his monochromatic white paintings, where he's using different applications of paint and different types of paint to really explore the full range of white. These were when they were printed, completely white prints. The binding oil that he used to mix the ink discolored over time, which he knew and was aware of. So these prints are some are titanium white, some are lead white, some are a combination of the two. And even as he's making them, he understands that these prints will change over time. I don't know if he quite anticipated the sort of range of beiges and peaches that would ultimately result, but he, kind of like Martin, is willing to embrace the unanticipated results that emerge from the process itself. So he's almost handing over some of his own authorship to the process by saying, I know these will change. That's out of my control. So across these prints, he is using different applications of aquatint, different applications of ink to create this range of tonalities. And so on some, you get this really thick application of ink. Again, we have this kind of pebbly texture. On other prints, it's very lightly printed, and you can see the paper fibers peeking through the inked areas. And here he has hand sawn the edge of the plate off so that it would have this wavy plate mark. And we can see the place where the plate ends, this sort of dimensional plate mark. You can see where the very edge of the plate itself is inked, and then where that aquatint is applied. So you really can see the kind of subtleties of how the aquatint plate is inked and the effect of that on the ultimate print. And he's also using all of the elements that typically are part of prints that we don't think of as elements. And so he is very intentional about where he signs and additions. I think I forgot to include the detail on the next slide, but in this print down here in the center, where there's an empty square and the ink is around the margins, he's sort of flipping the typical image margin. And so he signs the print up here and he additions it here. And so these marks that typically we think of as just sort of almost administrative, they take the space of the actual image while the print itself is in the margin, the parts of the print that we, sometimes even mat over, we don't think about as the image area. So he's playing with those conventions. He's turning the signature, the printer's chop. This is Catherine Brown's printer's chop. The edition number. He's turning those into elements that he incorporates into the print itself. And then the last group of works that I want to talk about in this section are artists who are interested in the process of learning printmaking and then sharing that process of learning with viewers. So this is Sylvia Plymouth Mangold's Aquatent Sugarlift and Golden Changes. This is a series of three prints, but she's almost showing us how she is learning these techniques. So in the first print, we see an aquatint ground and etching. In the second print, we see these marks from Sugarlift Aquatint. They seem like experimental, like she's figuring out what this technique can do. And then in the final print, we see her combining these techniques to create an image. But she doesn't only publish this final image, she shows us the process. Similarly, Etta Renouf's portfolio Marks is a portfolio of six where each of the prints in this series are made using a different technique, or a combination of techniques. So you can see, for example, the difference in lines when she's using an engraving burin versus an etching needle. And so it kind of serves almost as a primer of the range, and it's even called marks, the range of marks that you can produce through different types of printmaking. The next section of the exhibition is about the technical innovations of Parasol. And so the work that you see through from the last gallery is probably one of the most important prints of the 20th century. And so this is Keith by Chuck Close. You can see the scale of it. It is, almost takes up the presence of a painting. And when Bob invited Chuck Close to make this print, Close's condition was, I don't want to be the only person who's learning how to do something new. So if I'm challenging myself, everyone has to challenge themselves. And so he chose a technique that was largely completely out of use by the 20th century called mezzotint. This is a process that was primarily used before the ability to photomechanically reproduce photographs. And what it allows you to do is create ranges of tone. And so you roughen up a plate so that it prints completely black, and then you're basically erasing the image into it. So you're using a burnisher to flatten down those roughened up areas. And depending on how much you flatten it, depends on the more you flatten it, the lighter it will be. And so most mezzotints are at a very modest scale. Not only was Close going to, revive this medium, but he also wants to do it at a previously unheard of scale. This is about 3 by 4 feet. And so Feldman had to finance the purchase of a larger press to be able to print this, that Brown had to have lifted with a crane into Crown Point's workshop. At this point, she has now moved out of her basement into a dedicated workshop. And so you can see on the right, in this progressive proof, some of the process of how to make a mezzotint. So you see this is about halfway done. The parts that are black are the parts that Close hadn't yet burnished, and he's working his way across the image. And you can see here that, he starts right in the middle of the face where there's the most detail, where the focus is sharpest. But you can see that this area is printed slightly lighter than the rest of the print, because as he's working, he's trying to get a sense of, how much he needs to burnish in order to create certain tones. So he's having the printers proof the plate really frequently in order to sort of get that immediate gratification of seeing how something will print. But mezzotints are very, very fragile. This is only an edition of 10, because the more you run them through the press and exert that pressure, the more it flattens out that range, that spectrum of tones. And so this repeated proofing and also him sort of figuring out the process means that he kind of loses some of that depth. And once you go light, you can't go back. And this had been a tremendous undertaking. It took 3 weeks to even figure out how to make the plate print black. And another several weeks of Close actually working on the print. So the idea of starting over is really daunting, but also both Catherine Brown and Chuck Close really come to like this aspect of the print. They both say that it shows the process, that it demonstrates, what is unique and specific. It shows the challenges. Similarly, typically, in his photorealistic paintings, Chuck Close is starting with a grid that then gets painted over. But here you can see those grid lines stay in the print. And this is an element that not only does he like the sort of print, the slightly lighter mouth, he not only does this show the process, he really becomes interested in the visible grid. And so we see in another print, and this is a lithograph made a few years later, he is embracing that grid form. That becomes the sort of basis of the print. And in his paintings and drawings as well, he begins to use the grid, the visible grid, as an element that recurs throughout his work. So this is a way that printmaking is feeding back into his larger practice. He takes away with it not only the ability to claim I think up until this year, making the largest mezzotint ever. But also, in addition to those technical advancements, he takes something from printmaking, this idea of embracing the grid and making it visible in his work. Also in this gallery are these incredible screen prints by Richard Estes. Estes, another photorealistic painter. And so this screen print has about 180 layers of color. So it is not using halftone. It's not building up those colors by just combining red, yellow, blue, and black. Each color, each detail is its own screen. And so these are built up by hundreds of screens, adding in more and more details. And so these are not reproductions of paintings. He makes a full-scale maquette that exists only for, it is a working process piece for these prints. And then working with the printers at Edition Domberger, they would first break it into just a few colors. We have some progressive proofs of a different print here. So you can see, breaking it into its most basic colors, then working with the printers, adding in more details and then more details until we arrive at something like this, where the level of, capturing the reflections off of the glass windows, the cars deep, deep in the distance. This is through the accumulation of hundreds of screens printed over and over and over. And these are really large editions too. So the amount of work that goes into printing an edition is just remarkable. And actually, when this print was published, Feldman sent out an advertisement and said, if for every purchase of this print, I will buy you a round trip ticket to Stuttgart to see how these are printed. Because if you don't see them, you won't believe it. I don't know if anyone took him up on that, but clearly he wanted everyone to appreciate just how much sort of technical expertise went into producing these prints. And then the last thing in this gallery is the rubber stamp portfolio, which was a project in 1976, 77. And so the idea behind this was to take an incredibly modest medium, the rubber stamp, and produce a portfolio that was affordable. And so inviting some of the leading artists of the day to create these inexpensive prints in a large edition and sell them for just $100, with the hope of creating new print lovers, new audiences, new collectors, expanding the world of printmaking. So he's not just making prints, but also building an audience. Of course, the artist did not sort of take this idea of modesty that seriously, sort of modesty of the medium, and created prints that were just as complex as in any other medium. Instead of actual rubber stamps, most of them actually had to be letterpress printed because of the level of detail. You sort of get a sense in the Chuck Close print. He's experimenting with different scales. There's a tremendous level of detail. So this wasn't something that you could just stamp and it would turn out perfectly. Artists are experimenting with different types of papers. All in all, this became a much more ambitious project than intended, though still sold for $100. Tom Wesselman made a 10-color print. You can see some of those progressive proofs here. Some artists did truly embrace the concept behind the edition. So Carl Andre just took a regular bait stamp that you would use to number pages and made that the image. And as you'll notice, if you note the printers, this edition was actually printed by Bob Feldman's children, Andrea Stephen and Karen. So here he's kind of playing on the additionality of print, the seriality of print, by making that number stamp, normally what would be inscribed in the corner, that becomes the image itself. And the last print I'll talk about in this portfolio is Daniel Buren's. And so you'll see kind of throughout the gallery in these kooky places, these four prints in four different colors. And so in the 1,000 prints in this edition, on the back of each print, Buren included a set of instructions for where you have to hang this in your home. And the idea is that when all 1,000 people have purchased their prints and hung them on the wall, they would align to create a striped room, one wall, one color per wall. And you can see they're in different alignments. But if you hung them as specified, you could sort of conceptually align all 1,000 of those locations, and mentally they would create this installation. So he's really thinking about the possibility of printmakings. As a multiple to sort of create this community of printmaking. I'll go really quickly through the other two galleries, and then I want to leave some room for questions. So the next two sections are really represent a different generation of both artists and printers that Feldman and Parasol are working with. At this point, Crown Point Press starts its own publishing program. So Feldman starts working with different printers, many of whom were trained with Crown Point and then started their own practices. So the artists in this gallery are all loosely affiliated with the kind of category of new image painting, which was sort of loose affiliation that got its name from a 1979 show at the Whitney called New Image Painters. And so these artists, as early as 1976, Feldman was thinking about, what's next? What's the direction that the art world is moving in? And he said, I think the next thing is going to be artists who are taking the lessons of minimalism, but reincorporating figuration. And he really anticipated this move that would then define the late 70s and early 80s with artists like Jennifer Bartlett, Neil Jenny, Donald Sultan, Lois Lane, Susan Rothenberg. And so I'll just talk about a couple of these Donald Sultan prints. At this time, Sultan is making these large paintings using vinyl and linoleum tiles. So Feldman thought, okay, surely you want to make lino cut. But instead, he had seen the etchings that Parasol had produced. He really wanted to make etchings. But he took that idea of the lino cut and he created these linoleum shapes that he would then turn around and reorient and trace onto the plate. So he created this set of prints called Water Under the Bridge. For example, the one on the left is called boat/table, and then you see the same shape in sailor hats in the middle, and then some elements of the print on the left and the right, which is called half hats and whole. And so he's kind of going back to the Mangold and the Lewitt, playing with this idea of rotating and iterating through printmaking. And he's also really innovating on the form. So he had been making these large charcoal black lemons, and he gets interested in the idea of using the aquatint rosin as a kind of charcoal powder. And so instead of the typical way to make an aquatint, he dumps a bunch of this aquatint rosin onto the plate and using a glass tube blows it into the shape that he wants. So you get these sort of hazy charcoal, like really rich blacks, these sort of charcoal-like edges. And then you see that kind of dust that, scatters across the surface, texturing the background. And so even though it's a new generation of artists, you still see the way that they're embracing printmaking's possibilities and innovating on new ways of producing prints. Um, then finally, the second to last section, the last gallery, we're, moving on to the sort of next large generation of artists and neo-expressionists. So we see, these are very different from the minimal and conceptual prints that we started with. There's a lot more color, much more of a return to figuration, with prints by artists like David Sally and Julian Schnabel. Um, but again, even though these artists are working in a very different mode, they still are embracing the possibilities of printmaking. So here in the center, we have Julian Schnabel's Brenda, which is printed on velvet. Um, and so I mentioned when you're printing intaglio, you wet the paper and that wet paper goes into those recesses. So now think about having to print on velvet, which has a direction. When you mash it down, the fibers would tend to sort of spread rather than go exactly where you want them. So at this moment, Schnabel is making large velvet paintings. He's interested in how he could translate that into printmaking. And he's also interested in what makes printmaking unique, that it can produce multiples. So even though this is an edition, the image is the same in all of them. The color ink and the color velvet are different. So they're all unique within the edition. And they all have their own sort of color relationship. They all have their own figure ground relationship. So he's playing with creating unique works within the idea of an edition. Similarly, we have this print by Susan Pitt, which could well be called a sculpture. She's working again with Edition Domberger to create this three-dimensional, almost stage set that aligns with. She's primarily an animator, but had also done some stage design. And so now we see printmaking moving into 3 dimensions. And then we have artists like Eric Fischel, who, like the Robert Ryman prints that we looked at before, is using the plate mark as an element of the print. So he's known for these kind of psychologically fraught scenes. And here we can see that each of the 3 figures in this print are surrounded by their own plate mark. So instead of building up the prints using plates that are the exact same shape and size, so they perfectly align, he is making visible this border around each of the figures, which adds to this kind of psychological tension. Even though they're occupying the same space, they exist kind of in their own world. And I'll talk about one last project, in fact, the final project of Parasol. So the prints in the previous gallery were mostly made in the 80s and 90s, and Parasol is really sort of wrapping up in that moment. They continue to make prints with artists like Mangold and Lewitt. But really stop in the early 2000s until Bob Feldman, by chance, is on a plane ride with Daniel Rockmore, who is a professor at Dartmouth. And Feldman shares this idea that he had for a long time to make a portfolio with mathematicians. And so together they create Parasol's final portfolio, Kincinitas, where they invited 10 award-winning scientists, physicists, mathematicians, computer scientists to transcribe what they find to be the most beautiful equation, which were then printed as aquatints. And so it becomes this kind of circle story. Here we see these prints, which are the last that you see as you leave the gallery, are next to Mel Bachner's prints, many of which are investigating mathematical, logical principles. And so we return to Parasol's beginnings, where many of these minimal and conceptual artists are interested in the beauty of systems, of logic. And here we have mathematicians and physicists who are turning that into the subject of their print. But like many of these artists, they are using printmaking for the first time. So I love that this ends with this idea of printmaking's accessibility, Feldman insists on calling these mathematicians and scientists artists. And it's through the collaborative process of printmaking that they're able to enter into these same conversations as the previous 4 decades of artists. So thank you so much for this virtual tour through the exhibition. I will stop sharing my screen and hopefully we have some time. I'm running right at 4, but if people want to stay for a couple questions, I'm happy to stay on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. This was so wonderful to hear. I love this exhibition. Kind of their like, let's try it attitude with some of the processes, and also just the respect for the process and kind of revealing how it all works. So this context was great. Um, we do have a few questions that have come in, so if people want to put them in the Q&A, feel free. The first question that we have is kind of about are there any specific challenges to conserving the prints and any special consideration with like display methods for these pieces?
So, yeah, sure. So all prints are light sensitive. And so though they're getting, these prints are getting, their time out in the open during this exhibition, and some of them are traveling. It's standard that with works on paper, they then rest in storage because the sort of light damage is cumulative. And so this is a challenge with exhibiting works on paper, exhibiting prints, because they are, fragile, light sensitive techniques. And so the more they are exposed to light, the more they can fade from their sort of original presentation. And we can see that in the Ryman prints, although that's not fading, as I mentioned, that's the discoloration of the binding oil. But yes, all prints do come with sort of unique conservation concerns. Luckily, in a museum, we are able to store them safely after they come down on view. And it looks like Susan also specifically mentioned screen prints. What is difficult about screen prints is their surface is very, very, very delicate. So in the case of those Estes prints, for example, they stay framed because with a print that large, the amount of surface handling would make them really high risk for abrasions. And so for prints of those scale, they live in their frames in storage so that we don't risk interrupting that really vulnerable, sensitive surface.
Great, thank you. Um, Another kind of question about sort of the folks who you mentioned a lot of different artists, and someone wanted to know if many of the artists continued with printmaking, or did they return to the previous processes that they were using before the work shown here?
So both and many of these artists would continue to become prolific printmakers. Parasol Press actually published a catalog raisonné of Robert Ryman's prints and Robert Mangold's prints in the early 2000s. And some of those prints were those that they printed with Parasol, but many others were those that they had printed with other printers, with other workshops. And so I think that that is an interesting element of Parasol's legacy, is introducing these artists to a medium that they would then continue to work with across their career. I mentioned LeWitt was an especially prolific printmaker. They're all continuing to work in the mediums that they're had previously worked in or are best known for. But it is really remarkable how many artists continued to make prints for the rest of their careers.
And sort of a follow-up to that, someone wanted to know if it would be accurate that some of the print artists may not have been, have drawing skills, but rather more carving, etching skills.
Totally. So I think that's what's really interesting about the invitation to have conceptual and minimal artists make prints, because we think about printmaking as really a draftsman's medium, right? You are making marks onto the matrix. It is very closely related to drawing. And so the idea that these artists who are really moving away from that mode of working, most of them don't consider themselves draftsmen. They might not involve a lot of drawing in their working method. The idea of what they then do when they enter the printmaking workshop, I think we see that especially in that gallery Prints About Process, where it's like, okay, well, I'm not a draftsman, I'm not a drawer. What do I draw when I'm faced with this plate or this stone? And so I think it's really interesting how often it is printmaking itself that comes to mind. Like, what do I draw? I take inspiration from the things that I'm seeing, the things that I'm learning, the materials around me. And so I think that's part of also why we have this moment of innovation in printmaking, prints looking very differently than they have before, because the artists who are making them are coming from it at it from a very different perspective.
Thank you. And a question about one of a particular artist. Someone was curious about Chuck Close and sort of the how it's determined that he might be the most important printmaker. Is it like us looking at it now in our current day? Is it about sales, published works? You know,
Yeah.
how is that kind of determined?
So I wouldn't say he's the most important printmaker. I would say that specifically Keith is one of the most important prints precisely because of its technical innovation. And so just the scale and ambition of this print to use a technique that no one at this time was really trained in, and to not only embrace that technique, but embrace it for an incredibly precise photorealistic image, to work on a massive scale. The fact that it is only an edition of 10, this print has sort of established a reputation for this kind of, it sort of represents this huge ambition coming out of late 20th century printmaking. And so I think it's that specific print. I mean, Chuck Lewis does make a lot of prints, but it's really that one specifically that I think, because of just its, yeah, scale and ambition, many people have referred to it as the most significant print of the 20th century.
And it is one, if you see it in person, you really get a sense of the scale. It's a little bit harder to see the from the photographs, but it's a really impressive piece if you get a chance to see it in person. Um, I think we had a few mentions about folks that were part of this exhibition that maybe had connections to Phillips Academy. So Bob Feldman and was Frank Stella also?
Yeah, so Bob Feldman, Alan Stone, as I mentioned, and Frank Stella were all alums of Phillips Academy. Feldman, class of 1954. And what's significant about that trio in particular is that they're really responsible for helping to build up the Addison's modern and contemporary collection. So in the 90s, when there was the sort of realization that the Addison had a really strong collection of historic art, but didn't have the resources to keep pace with, the art world of the late 20th century. Frank Stella was unbelievably generous with donations, as was Feldman. And Feldman actually was on the committee to do this art drive to basically encourage alums to help bolster the modern contemporary holdings. So Feldman, Stone, and Frank Stella all played huge roles in shaping the modern contemporary collections of the Addison. Feldman both donating works published by Parasol Press and works from his own collection. Frank Stella giving us unbelievable treasures. So I think that also really speaks to, hopefully, the impact that the Addison had on students as they were students at Phillips Academy, that led to their desire to then give back and help continue this museum's ability to share art with not only Phillips Academy students, but with the broader community.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a good segue to, I think, the last question that sort of, for people who maybe are interested in learning more besides visiting and seeing in the exhibition, is there a publication or is there like maybe a list of
There is indeed.
artists?
So, oh, my camera is automatically refocusing. Sorry about that. There is a publication, and so this not only shares the history of Parasol, and includes images for all of the works in the show, but it also includes a catalog raisonné of all of the prints published by Parasol. And so the hope is that this continues to be a resource for people who are interested in this period of print history, of art history. And so now, through several years of research, we have now compiled within one volume the complete edition history of Parasol Press. So if you would like a better view, a closer image, or yeah, better images, I encourage you, you can purchase the book through Yale University Press or in person at the Addison. There's also a virtual tour available online on the Addison's website that might allow you to zoom in a little bit more if you want to get a closer look. Of course, no substitute for seeing the works in person, but many other ways to engage for those who are not in the Boston area.
Fantastic. Well, I will be sending along a link to this recording to everyone who joined us today and anyone who wasn't able to join us live. And I will link to the Addison's website, so you'll have that information and the virtual tour there as well. Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to share all of this wonderful information with us. I encourage everyone to visit the exhibition while it's on display and to visit the Addison anytime because things are always changing. You always have wonderful things to share, and we really appreciate you sharing it with all of us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Great, thank you.